Hey everybody, it's Ed. Before we start, I've got two very quick announcements. Number one is I want to thank some brand new podcast supporters. Molly Baldridge, Ben Clary, Carrie Andreessen, Zach Harris, Laura Burt, and Craig Barfoot. All these folks went to mountainprairie.com/support and decided to support the podcast financially, which I greatly appreciate. And it allows me to go on trips like the one I took to record this specific episode. So thank you very much. Second, I want to let you all know that we just recently opened up registration for the 2023 Strenuous Life Retreat at the Zapata Ranch here in Colorado. If you're not familiar with the Strenuous Life Retreat, it's 5 full days of adventure, learning, conversation, and camaraderie, all in the spirit of Theodore Roosevelt's commitment to living the strenuous life. We held the first annual retreat this past September, and it was a resounding success. We hiked high into the Sangre de Cristo mountain range, rode horses in Great Sand Dunes National Park, and alongside bison and elk on the Medno Ranch. We had discussions about conservation and regenerative agriculture with expert guests, and we started each day with strenuous exercise and ended the day with top-notch dinners and a campfire. Last year, the retreat sold out very quickly, so if you're interested in attending, I'd encourage you to claim your spot now. There's a link in the episode notes that will take you to some videos that I made, some photos, and all the information you need. Thanks so much. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain Prairie podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Douglas Brinkley. Doug is a world-renowned historian, author, and professor who may be best known to Mountain Prairie listeners as the author of The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America, and Rightful Heritage, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Land of America, both of which detailed the first 2 waves of the United States conservation movement. His most recent book is Silent Spring Revolution, John F. Kennedy, Rachel Carson, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and the Great Environmental Awakening, which delves into the 3rd wave of conservation and the rise of the modern environmental movement. I was lucky enough to read an advanced copy of Silent Spring Revolution, and I highly recommend it. Doug was raised in Ohio, and from an early age, his parents instilled in him a deep love and respect for wild places, national parks, and the rich history of conservation in the United States. After earning his M.A. and Ph.D. from Georgetown University, Doug began his career as a professor and historian, and he went on to teach at numerous prestigious institutions, including the U.S. Naval Academy, Princeton, Hofstra, Tulane, and most recently, Rice University. The prolific nature of Doug's writing life is really hard to comprehend. He's written extensively about everyone from TR to FDR, JFK to Rosa Parks, and about places ranging from the Alaskan wilderness all the way to the moon. He's the literary executor of Hunter S. Thompson's estate and has edited the diaries of Jack Kerouac for 2 separate books. He's also served on boards of numerous conservation organizations and has won awards for his contributions to the conservation movement. And all those accomplishments are really just scratching the surface of Doug's career. Doug has been a longtime literary hero of mine, and I credit The Wilderness Warrior with fueling my obsession with TR and inspiring me to move out of the real estate business and into land and water conservation work. So when I had the opportunity to join Doug at his home in Austin for a conversation about Silent Spring Revolution, I didn't hesitate to jump on a plane to Texas. We had a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation about the book, exploring everything from the life and work of Rachel Carson to the TR-like qualities of Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, to the environmental legacies of JFK, LBJ, and Nixon. We also talk about Doug's long-standing personal connection to conservation and how a deep love of teaching is at the core of all of his work. Doug talks about the roles that art and music play in his life, what gives him hope for the future, and much more. The episode notes are jam-packed with everything we discussed, so be sure to visit the episode webpage for copious resources and links. Again, I highly recommend Silent Spring Revolution, but really, I highly recommend all of Doug's work. I greatly appreciate Doug welcoming me into his home and taking the time to chat, and I hope you enjoyed both this conversation and Silent Spring Revolution as much as I did. Dr. Brinkley, I can't believe I'm talking to you. This is awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time during such a busy time, both with your new book and with the election. I love the book, and I could talk to you for 10 hours about it and still not scratch the surface. But I wanted to start out, the thing I love about your books are they create these through lines through history where you can kind of jump on and you learn about all these different people and how they were connected to this theme that you may not have known. And, this book is obviously kind of post-World War II up until the early 70s, but it really starts, I think, both with the book and with your personal interest in it with Thoreau, I think.
Well, I wrote a book called The Wilderness Warrior on Theodore Roosevelt, and that covered that early conservation progressive movement, TR, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, and the gang. That was 1901 to 1909, and TR saved about 234 million acres of wild America through national monuments, creating the U.S. Forest Service, creating national wildlife refuges of today. I found out writing that the second big reform movement was with FDR, and it's called the Second Wave, when Franklin Roosevelt and Harold Ickes created all sorts of new national parks. FDR did 800 state parks.
It's crazy.
The CCC created tree planting programs. Billions of trees got planted during the Dust Bowl era and the like. But the third one was what I call the long 60s, 1960 to 1973. And that didn't have a president leading the conservation charge. The presidents followed the public. And so the hero of my book is Rachel Carson, because it's her book, Silent Spring, when it came out in 1962, that married the Rooseveltian preservationist with public health concerns, meaning if you're spraying DDT, not only are eagles and osprey getting ill, but your children might be in your backyard. Mm-hmm. And we had three presidents that were part of what we call today the long 60s environmental movement. And that's John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. And all of them get an A minus mark for leadership on the field of conservation as it turned into environmentalism. So I've now documented the three waves, but my Holy Spirit sitting on my shoulder is Henry David Thoreau, because hands down, he's the writer who has most influenced me. I go back to Walden all the time, but also in this book, I didn't realize before, but John F. Kennedy was a huge fan of the book Cape Cod by Thoreau, and if you haven't read it, you should. And Rose Kennedy, his mother, and of course Rachel Carson wrote three books about the oceans that Kennedy loved. So I'm dealing with ocean conservation a lot as a progenitor for this long 60s environmental movement.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I thought was really interesting was John F. Kennedy's connection to the ocean, and that was really what got him hooked on conservation. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about Kennedy and his family's connection to the sea and to the seashore and how that kind of ended up being his entry point into this unbelievable conservation legacy.
Well, John F. Kennedy was born 1917 in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, which is on the ocean. But as a boy, his mother took him constantly to swim at Walden Pond. It was like that's where all the Kennedy kids learned to swim.
So crazy,
Rose Kennedy was a fanatic on Thoreau. Her childhood, her golden days of her childhood were spent in Concord, Massachusetts. So she was a Thoreauvian through and through. She went to Russia, hunting the libraries of Russia to make sure they were carrying the complete works of Thoreau during the Cold War. John F. Kennedy took a love to the sea. He was, a yachtsman, a salesman, a swimmer. It becomes famous with Kennedy on Cape Cod and Hyannisport. But what's in the 1950s, when he was a young senator, William O. Douglas, Supreme Court Justice, friend of the Kennedy families, said basically, Jack, you got to find an environmental or conservation issue. Mm-hmm. And as they spoke, it became clear that saving of the national seashores, what was called the vanishing seashores in government reports, would be what interested Jack Kennedy. Mm-hmm. So he then started campaigning as a senator in the 1950s for a Cape Cod national seashore. This was no slight thing because Cape Cod is a gorgeous parcel of America. It's an oceanfront property, and you have towns like Provincetown and Wellfleet and Truro. Yet Kennedy envisioned that those communities could live surrounded by this incredible national seashore. And sure enough, once he's elected president, in his first year in office, he creates Cape Cod National Seashore. And then in his second year, he pushes for Padre Island in Texas to save pristine part of the Gulf of Mexico. Mm-hmm. And then he does Point Reyes, which is north of Golden Gate Bridge, near Muir Woods in California. Spectacular place. All three Kennedy saved, but he started this idea of seashore preservation and lakeshore preservation that took off in the 1960s. And due to Vietnam and civil rights, it doesn't get talked about that much. But Lyndon Johnson would save Cape Lookout, in North Carolina, or Assateague in Virginia, Maryland, Fire Island in New York. I mean, Richard Nixon saves Cumberland Island in Georgia, and I'm just scratching the surface. If you go in the Great Lakes, they're all being saved then. Apostle Islands in Wisconsin, Picture Rock, Sleeping Bear Dunes in Michigan, Indiana Dunes in Indiana. So we did a great job of expanding our national park units to include lake shores and seashores in the 1960s. And Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon all deserve credit for being part of that movement.
Well, what's so interesting about that to me is that, when TR would do these wide swaths of land, whether in the American West or, when land was conserved in Alaska or set aside, but this is prime development property in post-World War II America where, developers have power, and yet they went after these very highly developable parcels and conserved them.
Brilliantly said. Exactly. That's a lot harder to get Cape Cod done than it is to save some of the Brooks Range in Alaska. It's really high real estate areas. And just go to Point Reyes in California, and it's the most pretty part of the coast just north of Marin County, one of the richest counties in America. And it's all windswept and safe for people to just experience the Pacific ecosystem and all of its grandeur. So yeah, these were brave policies, and it had political battles behind all of them. I mean, the one for Padre Island in Texas, Lyndon Johnson didn't want it. Yeah. He saw condos and hotels.
He got people to vote against it.
He voted against it, and with his own president. But Kennedy went along and worked with Ralph Yarborough, then a liberal Democratic senator from Texas, and got it done. We've got to see that Jack Kennedy's really interesting. We see him on a boat or sailing, but he really had what's called blue mind. Kennedy was only happy on a waterway, and particularly the ocean. He was addicted to the ocean, and he had a bad back, Addison's disease. His way of de-stressing was to leave shore where nobody could reach him. And so his principal parts of the country he loved the most were Cape Cod, Newport, Rhode Island, and coastal Florida, and where Lyndon Johnson was a rancher from Texas, and Johnson had more of a cowboy frontier rancher view of land custodianship. Johnson had cattle and the like, but Johnson did believe you judged a man's character by how he took care of his land as a rancher. And so he got really interested in wilderness, I think, more than John F. Kennedy did, even though Kennedy was for it, meaning a big, acre, 9.1 million acres Johnson signed in into saving in 1961 so you have roadless areas.
Yes.
And that roadless movement is big because, yes, humans are going to, you walk in with a hunting rifle or go camping or fishing, your humans are changing the ecosystem. But we understand what it's trying to do. It's trying to block some acreage that it looks a little bit more like in the pre-Columbian era, as closely as we can, and where wildlife habitat can have a sanctuary in which to thrive.
You mentioned William O. Douglas, and that was one of the big takeaways for me in this book, because I'd obviously heard his name, but I just didn't know much about him. And he's one of the characters that goes through the whole story. And in a way, correct me if you disagree, he's like a TR character. He kind of does these outdoor events where the press happen to know that he's doing it. He writes books. He's not scared to speak up. Yet Supreme Court justice, it's just hard, as I can't imagine a modern day president going down the River of Doubt, I can't imagine a Supreme Court justice going on hikes with the press. So could you just give a brief, people need to read the book, but please just give a brief sketch of who this guy was.
William O. Douglas was Theodore Roosevelt reincarnate. He nailed it. He grew up in Yakima, Washington, and when he was young, he couldn't walk because of a polio-like condition. And he started hiking the arid valleys, the fruit orchards of Yakima, but then expanded into conquering all the great mountains of the Pacific Northwest, Mount Adams being one that he particularly loved, but Mount Baker and others. And Douglas is a hotshot lawyer. He went to Whitman College in Washington, but then becomes, the big shot at Columbia University and a professor at Princeton. And then he gets poached by Joseph Kennedy to run the Security Exchange Commission and to bust companies that are involved with malfeasance of some kind. But he was a rough and ready outdoorsman. Douglas could name all the wildflowers, knew all of the bird life, and wanted to hike all of the major peaks in North America. And, he wrote a book on hiking the Himalayan mountains, not just North America. But his passion for conservation knew no bounds. And he, has been underplayed in history for his protest hikes. And I document many of them. For example, he hiked 186 miles to save the C&O Canal outside of Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, Maryland, to demand that not a freeway or a road wasn't built, and we saved some of that canal. He did protest hikes along the Olympic Strip in Washington State to keep the beaches pristine in Washington. He went canoeing in the Buffalo River in Arkansas to demand that no dam be built to ruin the beautiful buffalo. He went to Kentucky and fought and successfully to save the Red River Gorge, and a young Wendell Berry was part of that campaign. One after the other. I could eat up the broadcast here just talking about Douglas's, and he won them all.
Yeah.
He threw himself into these, and then he wrote really two gorgeous books called My Wilderness. One was dealing with his favorite spots east of the Mississippi River, and one on the west, and mainly in the Pacific, but the desert also. And so if you haven't read them, try to read William O. Douglas's books, My Wilderness.
Okay.
But he stayed on and so long that he then started arguing that trees and rocks have standing. He shut down Walt Disney from building a theme park in the Sierras. He everywhere you went, and you have to realize Douglas is operating when we don't have an environmental protection agency. There is no EPA till 1970. So Douglas was seeing all these environmental woes, no proper sewage treatments, overdamming, destroying lakes and rivers. And so his office becomes like a one-man way station at the Supreme Court. If you were a chapter of the Audubon Society or Isaac Walton League or Trouts Unlimited, and you had an issue that you were working on, conservation issue, all you wanted to do was get a packet of info onto Douglas's desk. And he would find a way to get either a columnist to write about it, a radio broadcast, or Eric Severide on CBS, who was one of his closest hiking friends, to do a story on it. So it really was an underground railroad network where Douglas was the hub. And Rachel Carson was really one of the spokes. Douglas backed her Silent Spring action early But she transcends Douglas because her book is so powerful that really she becomes the issue. In the person of Rachel Carson stands the new environmental ethos, which would dominate the 60s and continues to dominate our thinking about ecology and the environment all the way till this late in the 21st century.
Well, that was my next question is Rachel Carson. Obviously, my wife spent most of her career in the nonprofit environmental world. I'm in have been in conservation. So I knew who Rachel Carson was, knew of Silent Spring, but I didn't fully appreciate it, as is the case every time I read something you write about. Rachel Carson, scientist, world-class storyteller, kind of combining those together. Can you just give a brief overview of how she ended up, really, I guess the most interesting thing to me is how she ended up connecting with Kennedy and with those folks through her work?
Well, Rachel Carson was born in Springdale, Pennsylvania. You can visit her birthplace. It's along the Allegheny River. Pennsylvania gave us a lot of our great conservationists. Howard Zahniser of the Wilderness Societies from Pennsylvania. Harold Ickes was from Pennsylvania. Gifford Pinchot, Edward Abbey, John Salyer. I'm missing a bunch. It's a long list. Pennsylvania. And the Allegheny River in particular. My father grew up in Clarion, Pennsylvania. Okay. And so he's very much involved with trying to protect in his 90s the Clarion River in western Pennsylvania. Yeah. And so she, though, didn't live by the ocean, but she would find some fossils and read books about it. But she decided, after going to Chapman School in Pittsburgh, she then goes east on scholarship and becomes a zoologist, gets a zoology degree at Johns Hopkins. But her seminal moment was going to Woods Hole, which is just down a little road from the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. I mean, you can walk from
Isn't that crazy?
Woods Hole to the Kennedy home. And what Woods Hole was the most fascinating place on the Cape because all of these scientific boats, marine biologists, they built America's great ocean library there. So if you were going to study anything. And she went there and started studying. She got a great interest in eels early on. Their incredible migratory journeys across continents into American river systems. I mean, that you could find an eel in Pennsylvania that actually had come from Africa, Wow. It was very stunning to her. And she started writing then for the Baltimore Sun on nature, conservation, hired at U.S. Fish and Wildlife, wrote radio scripts about our fish stock. She wrote about, the shad. She wrote about trout, you name it. But then she got hired to write a series of booklets called Conservation in Action. Mm-hmm. And that was a little bit like the WPA guides of the Roosevelt years, that they were doing a institutional history of each national wildlife refuge. Oh. And she took on a lot of them. The one I particularly love is her one on Parker National Wildlife Refuge in Utah. Meaning she writes about Utah wildlife refuges, Massachusetts, Virginia. She's writing a lot of these little booklets. And she then starts writing books about the oceans, and she has a trilogy. Today you can easily get them. They're in the Distinguished Library of America volumes. Ably put together all three of her best-selling, and I underline the word best-selling books. She would rocket to number one on the nonfiction list with her books. And at the same time, Jacques Cousteau was becoming a household name. So after World War II, there became the mystery of the sea. Just like we do space exploration. There was in the 50s this real interest in marine and oceans because with radar and other detective devices developed and perfected during World War II, now we could go deeper under the water and learn more about the oceans. And so these books were very available and ones that Jack Kennedy gravitated to. The whole Kennedy family, I should say, gravitated to. I talked to Gene Kennedy Smith about how that was a big deal because Rose was pushing Rachel Carson. Mom was telling them they had to read Rachel Carson. Anne Lindbergh Morrow wrote about Sanibel Island, about the seas too, which was a bestseller. It was in the mix. But she left Fish and Wildlife, but she had started right after World War II worried about DDT. And that's because at Patuxent Wildlife Center in Maryland, We using DDT in the war to spray our soldiers so they didn't get ill from malarial type diseases from mosquitoes or lice or other things. They found out at Patuxent by experimenting on a river and a woodland system that it was making the wildlife ill, extremely ill. And Rachel Carson had access to all of that raw scientific data. And she wanted to write about it. She even pitched Reader's Digest right after World War II. They rejected her. But she hobby-horsed it through the 50s. And by the late 50s, she decided she had to warn about the DDT menace and other insecticides that weren't regulated, that were just being sprayed. And you must keep in mind aerial spraying. You were going over vast parcels of agriculture with it. Do you know Jimmy Carter's from Plains, Georgia, Sumter County? His mother died of pancreatic cancer. His father died of pancreatic cancer. His brother Billy died of pancreatic cancer. His sister Ruth died of pancreatic cancer. His sister Gloria died of pancreatic cancer. Only Jimmy Carter avoided it because he was in the Navy all those years when they were spraying crops like that. And the case that garnered the national interest in the late 50s was Marjorie Spock, who was an organic farmer with a little bit of money on Long Island. And she sued because she was trying to grow organic produce, and yet either Suffolk County, Long Island airplanes or state agriculture or the USDA, people were flying over all the farmlands there and dust spraying them. And she's like, I'm an organic farmer. I have a right to grow organic, a constitutional right. Who has a right to spray these chemicals over my property? So she sued. And her brother was Benjamin Spock, who was known as the great baby doctor.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And that's her brother. So, she knew how to garner some headlines.
Yeah.
And this goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and they throw it out, except William O. Douglas writes a biting dissent. And Douglas says that Marjorie Spock, that the government does not have a right. You have a right to be an organic farmer. Nobody has a right to spray these pesticides that have been uneven tested and to ruin your business as an organic farmer.
Yeah.
So that got in the press, and Douglas promoted it a lot. And meanwhile, Rachel Carson's working her way on her book, and she's getting the court transcripts from that case, which a lot of science was involved with. And so when her book first came out in serial rights in the New Yorker, it became a big deal. And at a press conference in the summer of 1962, with just the New Yorker excerpts out, Kennedy was asked about it. And he said that, because of Ms. Carson's book, we're going to have a scientific panel, basically, advisory panel, look into it. And he was good for his word, Kennedy. First off, this is a special moment, Kennedy embracing Carson's book. It's a little like in American history, only a few books have these galvanizing effects. Thomas Paine, when he wrote Common Sense in the American Revolution, or Harriet Beecher Stowe with Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Upton Sinclair on the meatpacking industry.
I love that, and I love that comparison.
Yeah, and so that's what Silent Spring became like, and it took them less than a year, but some months, and there's the President's Scientific Advisory Committee report said Carson's research was accurate, that these chemicals and pesticides were detrimental to the health of humans and were devastating wildlife. And yet the chemical industry put up, it's really like today's oil and gas lobby, chemical manufacturing lobby tried to smear and put down Rachel Carson, calling her every name in the book. She was brave. She testified. She did a dynamite debate on CBS Reports with Eric Sevareid, and it finally DDT does get banned, and it gets banned by William Ruckelshaus, the first head of the EPA, in 1972. So from 62 to 72, we call it the DDT Wars, and in the end, the environmentalists, the anti-pesticide, or at least these types of pesticides, people won. And out of these DDT wars grew the concept of environmental law. Think of William O. Douglas as the grand poobah of environmental law. But all of these young kids going into law school, many of them started wanting to join the environmental movement, and they became environmental lawyers. I write in the book about, in 1967, a group, the Environmental Defense Fund, was created with its motto, "Sue the Bastards."
Yeah.
And the reason why there was a strand in Douglas and in Environmental Defense Fund that said, look, the only way to really win is to go after these companies and sue them. If you're going to go after the person that's breaking whatever laws exist, state or federal, and sue them in court, that's the only way you're going to get industries to clean up their acts. And this, of course, up till today, annoys businesses in America. This movement led to NEPA. 1969, Nixon signs the National Environmental Policy Act, and NEPA demands on any new building project that you're going to have an environmental impact statement.
Yep.
And that is a bane of a lot of real estate developers that want to immediately go and pour concrete and build, that they have to issue an environmental impact report. Well, that also means a lot of people have to have jobs in environmental law, because if you want to build a Walmart store, you got to hire environmental lawyers to write the environmental impact statements.
Yep.
So it really allowed environmental law to grow into this very large field that it is today. And it's become the defense mechanism of protecting our treasured landscapes and making sure that our air quality and water quality are up to par.
Not to try to be a psychologist here, but one thing I was thinking about with Rachel Carson, so when she published the book, she had cancer. And so there was this race, I would think, in her mind to she was working hard as she was suffering from cancer to get the word out. And then you look at Kennedy, and he was suffering from debilitating back pain that a lot of people didn't know about. And I wonder if those two may have bonded a little bit, whether they knew each other's struggles or not, with this. It's almost like a crazy hunger to do the work, no matter what is going on in the background. And then you think about TR. He had plenty of tragedy in his life, yet he was forced to go forward, action, like we were just talking about before we recorded it. Do you think there was a bond there, just kindred spirits?
Well, there was. And you have to see Rachel Carson work for the Democratic Advisory Council, giving Democratic Party advice on ecology and conservation.
Yeah.
She took part in the plank of the Democratic Party. She was part of a women's group for JFK. She had Jackie Kennedy, had her at her house with Eleanor Roosevelt and other greats. Rachel Carson would go out to Robert F. Kennedy's home Hickory Hill and hold seminars on wildlife. She was deeply embedded in the larger Kennedy circle, Rachel Carson. But the criticism of Carson is that her book got written while she was going through chemotherapy, hence she was emotional. Some people would call Rachel Carson hysterical and wanting to see these companies were causing cancer, according to things. So it made her more of a warrior. There's truth to that. Obviously, if you're really, you're at least feeling what cancer is, I would think. And Jack Kennedy was always living on borrowed time due to his really debilitating Addison's disease. Interestingly enough, Kennedy's sickness, his pain, has made people not understand that he loved the outdoors. Like William O. Douglas used to say, Jack, the problem with you is you haven't slept outdoors enough. But what Kennedy didn't fully realize is he couldn't go do one of these hikes with Douglas. He could sign legislation for it, but he couldn't walk with his back on these massive hikes. Bobby Kennedy did.
Yeah.
Bobby Kennedy went everywhere with Bill Douglas. Bobby and Ethel Kennedy hiked the Olympic Peninsula, or went down the C&O Canal, and went, so Bobby was sort of the surrogate for JFK. But I had thought about writing my book, Silent Spring Revolution, alluding to what you're getting at. She dies Kennedy's killed in Dallas in November of 1963, and Rachel Carson is dead in 1964. And I was going to end my book, Silent Spring Revolution, there. It's a very, very proper way to end it. But the problem with that was what the two of them had conjured, whether it was hiring Stuart Udall as Interior Secretary or backing Bill Douglas or creating these senators that were putting environment first, like Frank Church of Idaho and Ed Muskie of Maine, the story goes on. I mean, DDT doesn't get banned in 1972. The fight now is to create an environmental protection agency. The Wilderness Act that Rachel Carson was so behind, roadless wilderness preserves, doesn't get formulated until Johnson signs it in 64. And the second prong of that doesn't happen until 1968 when Johnson signs Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, keeping pristine rivers and waterways in America clean. So I realized that it's a movement, and the Carson-Kennedy effect goes all the way to 73. Why 73? In December of 73, December 28th, Richard Nixon signs the Endangered Species Act. And it's a serious act. Mm-hmm. This is not you know how we're used to just these kind of, fig leaf laws, a real deal. People really trying to save wildlife in it. And I salute the 92-0 vote in the Senate for the Endangered Species Act. What was the symbol of the act? How did it get done? The bald eagle that Rachel Carson was focused on, the thinning of the eggshells due to pesticides and chemicals being sprayed were decimating the eagle. So the symbol of the United States was on its way to extinction in North America. Mm-hmm. That was a motivating factor. Now, there are other ones, a key deer in Florida became charismatic, and then there's fights for the black-footed ferret and people that wanted to save predators like wolves and coyotes and, panthers and the like. I write in the book on the Endangered Species Act of 73. There's so much that it did, but I really focused on Florida and its ability there to extend through the Everglades and wildlife corridors, the opportunity to allow something like the Florida panther to survive today, or manatee to have at least a chance at success. Mm-hmm. And that fact that Nixon proudly did it surprised me. And I went and talked to Nixon's daughter, Tricia Nixon Cox, and she doesn't talk to the media, period. But I happened to be at a dinner with her husband, and he said, my father-in-law did so much for the environment. You guys, you historians, meaning me, never give him credit. And I said, well, every photo of him is walking on a beach with a suit and wingtips. He's never wrote about the outdoor life. You guys, your family and your backers don't talk to scholars because you feel burned by Watergate. And so, you guys, if you're going to make it, well, they were just when I talked to Ed Cox getting into it, the Nixon Library now has a wonderful outdoor Endangered Species Act sculpture garden.
Great.
Really
as
neat
they
for
should.
kids.
Yeah.
And they're starting to realize that this is a huge legacy thing. So she wrote me, to her credit, answering my question, and she wrote me a long letter about her father and the outdoor life, and parts of it were a daughter defending her father and how much he loved dogs and, hand-fed deer at Camp David and those things. So she told me about how he chose redwood and sequoia trees to gift to China in exchange for panda bears, which I didn't really think about what we gave them. But there's a real case that he was a California politician, Nixon, living in San Clemente on the ocean in his backyard. It may have had a NIMBY cast to it, but, Santa Barbara oil spill didn't make him real happy. It was a devastation out there, and a lot of Republicans that were wealthy donors to Nixon, said this is unacceptable, or our beaches are all being destroyed. So he was what I would call an attentive politician. And then when the Cuyahoga River caught fire in Ohio, and, it's on the cover of Time magazine, and the magazine had real power back then, and the news media is covering it. And so Nixon acted. And the emotive part of him, which I never knew, was marine mammals. He was really interested in whale watching. If you go out to Dana Point and Laguna Beach, you see it's a thing out there. And his best friend was B.B. Rebozo, lived in Key Biscayne, Florida. And B.B. was a wealthy conservationist only because he didn't want anybody building anything near his mansion. But Nixon had an interest in that. He got very interested in sea mammals, and also Flipper was on television, and about dolphins, and people were getting whale songs, and it's of interest to people. And so it surprised me in the end to have to look at some of Nixon's record because I don't rank him very high as a president due to his anti-Semitism, due to Watergate, due to all this. But the environment, he did what a leader should do, and he listened to the public. Mm-hmm. He also had John Ehrlichman, who went to prison for Watergate, was an environmental lawyer from Seattle. And he was, many people like David Brower of the Sierra Club called Ehrlichman a covert green in the Nixon White House. And Nixon also liked Scoop Jackson of Washington, who had pushed through in 1968 North Cascades National Park. Mm-hmm. And Scoop, if you say Washington State, military, right? Boeing. They used to call Jackson senator from Boeing. So Jackson stayed pro-Nixon Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. But his office staff was coming up with visionary environmental legislation, Jackson. And Nixon was willing to sign off of it on Jackson, anything Jackson's office generated. Because Jackson wasn't a liberal denouncing him daily over Vietnam, like George McGovern, like Eugene McCarthy, like Gaylord Nelson, like 40 other top Democrats. Mm-hmm. So this Jackson-Nixon axis was pretty interesting. And also, while I'm on it, Pacific Northwest does so much. I always thought the environmental movement was born in California, mm-hmm. but the smart environmental crowd are in Oregon and Washington.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk about that even today with the current climate change initiatives.
Yeah, they really know how to do environmental law up there in ways that are they think about how to bring in the opposition into mm-hmm. things in the Pacific Northwest. Better the Brinkley approach is my way or the highway, and that often works. But for this really deep, meaningful environmental legislation, I mean, we owe it to people like William Ruckelshaus of Seattle and John Ehrlichman, Scoop Jackson, who were able to sell progressive environmental legislation, even though they were rather conservative people.
One of the points, I saw you say this in a lecture that I watched. You were talking about Ruckelshaus and how he said that the environmental movement doesn't pay attention as it should to the most basic thing that we can think of, sewage treatment. And
he drove that home to me, and he's right.
Yeah.
He thought that the big thing that happened in the 60s and 70s in the conservation world, environmental world, was sewage treatment plants. We were just dumping raw
it
sewage.
into the water.
And I didn't even realize when he became head of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, Atlanta had no sewage treatment system. They're just dumping all in 70. He gave them a year to get it built, get it done, or they were going to be peoples were going to be charged by the federal government for crimes. He really got tough, Ruckelshaus, as a cop, mm-hmm. law and order EPA. It's one reason the EPA is not liked a lot by a lot of corporate entities today is because Ruckelshaus came out fairly, but he looked at the science, looked at what's going on, looked at and played it by the letter of the law, mm-hmm. and he saw polluters that were breaking the law that you had to do law enforcement. You had to bust them.
Yeah,
and I feel the EPA today should be named after William Ruckelshaus. He was superb at EPA. When Reagan had to call him back for a second time when EPA was floundering, and he saved it then. But Ruckelshaus' point on a more jovial way was a lot of people going into environmental law want to write, like me, I want to write a book about some the Great Basin National Park in Nevada, which I love, or they want to write a book about the Badlands of North and South Dakota, or about a fight to save wolves. He's saying the real battle was sewage treatment, in that it's a constant battle, and that we now we had a big success. And Nixon at one point even says, always griping about how the liberals in the academic world, it's like Lyndon is going to be known for saving Redwood National Park, for the redwood saving. I'm going to be known as the, if anything, I'm going to be the sewage guy. yeah, he was all, and he's not raw, it's just classic Nixon.
Yeah, that is classic.
Carping, but they did it, and they started us on that road. And so what you're looking today in 2022 out of the Republican Party today, or the Trump movement, they're trying to undo Nixon. They're trying to undo NEPA, EPA, Clean Air and Water Act, Endangered Species. They're trying to weaken that period. Nobody's trying to weaken the Wilderness Act of 64 really, or Wild and Scenic Rivers of 68 of Johnson, but the Nixon legacy's under attack.
Yeah, it's so crazy how that was as bipartisan as something can be. And now, where I live out in Colorado in the West, the Endangered Species Act is just hated, especially by the agricultural community.
Well, because there was a feeling on the Endangered Species Act that I think the spirit, some people thought it was for what I guess we call charismatic fauna, or charismatic creatures like manatee or like bald eagle or and that they might have to make compromises for some of those creatures. But now it's, applied to, a mouse or a little lizard or a little fish. And that's what infuriates a lot of ranchers and a lot of, commercial real estate developers.
Sure. When you're writing a book like this, one of my favorite books of yours is The Magic Bus. I love it. And I feel like that lays such a great foundation of you as a teacher. And I feel like with these books, you take these just ridiculously complex subjects and you're able to present them in their full complexity. So everybody fully understands how complex this is, but it's in a way that somebody like me can consume it and learn from. When you're writing a book, when you're digesting all this information, how much are you thinking about being a teacher? Because I really do think of you as whether you know it or not, you're my teacher.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. That's the highest compliment you could give me. My mother and father both were teachers. And so I lived in that kind of household. My dad went on to do other things. He got out of teaching. But my mom, when I grew up in high school, I hid from her. It was horrifying having mom teaching in my same high school.
Sure.
I never took a class from her, never wanted to even see her in the corridor. But it rubbed off, and we would take we used to have a Pontiac station wagon and a coachman trailer. And so when teachers don't get paid a lot, but you do get some weeks off in the summer. And so we would go travel all across the United States. I went to an awful lot of these national parks in the lower 48. We didn't do Alaska. My dad had been a ski trooper in Alaska for the military and Korean War.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he was stationed up there. I've subsequently wrote a book about Alaska and go up there a lot. But when my childhood, we were lower 48 with the trailer. So I got to go to the Everglades or Big Bend, Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Glacier, most of them. And now once I expanded after I grew up, I started going to visit now, trying to see all the ones I have seen or haven't seen. And I'm kind of a passport with the parks person. Nice. I want to go to all of them. So I really love that. And I try to learn about them. And one thing I did notice on all these trips I used to be before, the internet, I used to grab those pamphlets at every little motel or KOA we were at. And on any place saved as a federal park, it either was saved by Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt. And so always stuck with me. Another one by them. My God. And even today, there's, much as I would like to tell you Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon got it, they were no Theodore or Franklin Roosevelt. Those two were amazing on the natural world aspect. And then, you find favorite places. Now I'm very high on Michigan.
Oh, so many great writers and conservationists come out of Michigan. When you're talking about Pennsylvania, I was thinking about Michigan as another place in my mind.
Unbelievable up there. And so we've been going up to Sleeping Bear Dunes.
Nice.
And it's, outside of Traverse City in Empire, Michigan. I just spent last summer at Medora, North Dakota.
Oh, did you really?
I have yet to be there. I was a Theodore Roosevelt scholar there, and I love that national park. They're building a Theodore Roosevelt presidential library there, and I like the Badlands there a lot. And now I'm working quite a bit to get involved with Ken Burns and others on trying to, really protect some of the Missouri River as it goes through Montana, the old Lewis and Clark country. and so, I keep wanting to explore different places. On the east, I've really fallen in love with Pisgah National Forest near Asheville, North Carolina.
It's one of my favorite places. Davidson River. I just love it.
It's just gorgeous there and special. And,
cradle of forestry.
Yeah, the whole cradle of forestry there and all, and the little Brevard College. And so, at any rate, it's just a joy in my life to get to go since childhood, travel and see all these wonderful places. So I feel I need to be a teacher about how we save them and maybe inspire people. I tell young people today that are worried about climate change, become a friend of a national park or state park, or if you find something about a wildlife that you're interested in, work to protect it, work to save and clean a lake, or meaning we can do things. It just doesn't have to be the one doomsday scenario of climate, but you can also do land and water conservation projects that are meaningful and your voice will matter, and get started that way. And read Thoreau and read Rachel Carson. And get thinking about it. And then maybe when you get older, you'll go to do more in the environmental field if you'd like. But everybody, no matter what wants to save a wild place. I mean, if I go up to around Ohio where I grew up, and if I have a big audience in Cleveland, let's say, and if I say, we need to clean Lake Erie so you can swim it again and can have the fish back, I'll get a standing ovation. If I go to the same audience and say there's a new environmental, I lose half the audience.
Yep.
Because the word environment has been seen as been hijacked by the Democrats or painted on the Democrats. And it's become part of the partisan thing. But the good news is most people in the United States want their lake clean, want their rivers clean, want the fish back, want migratory birds to come. You're dealing with an unbelievable majority of people when you're dealing with America the Beautiful. Yeah. And so in my book, Silent Spring Revolution, I write a lot about the battles to save the Canyonlands in Utah and North Cascades in Washington and Guadalupe in Texas and many more of the iconic parks, and some that we already mentioned.
That what you just said about the audience, and when you say environmental, that was one of the reasons that I want to start this podcast, because I'd be talking to a right-wing rancher who's saying he wants to see the land conserved, and then talking to my neighbor when I lived in Boulder who's a militant environmentalist, and they shared 90% in common. But you start saying jargon, green, environment, whatever. One other question about your process that I find so interesting. You've obviously got every credential a historian could ever have and had so much success. Yet there's another part of your life that is highly immersed in the arts and in music, and you've got all these great relationships, like with Hunter S. Thompson and then Bob Dylan. How important is that more arts-focused part of your life, kind of balancing out the sections of your brain? Because
my arts are deeply connected to me. In fact, I'll show you when we're done, but right there on the side is a painting of Lena Horne by Duke Ellington that's signed, and I just love all the music of Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, Coleman Hawkins, and the rest. I mean, it's a big part of my life. I write with a lot of jazz. Dylan, like everybody, I just adore Dylan. I once pleaded with Jan Wenner, the owner of Rolling Stone, to let me profile Bob. He made me tell him why me, and I had to promise, which of course was false, but I'd name a kid after him. I'd do anything. I really wanted to do this because everybody wants to interview Bob Dylan. And I got to do it, and I got to know Dylan pretty well. And in fact, I did not only after that Rolling Stone cover story I wrote, I know him as a person. And after he won his Nobel Peace Prize in literature, I was the only person that, for public prints that he would talk to. And I did a long, 2 full pages of New York Times interview of Bob. But, right before you came today, I was listening to Warren Zevon, and I got to know Warren pretty well, and because he was friends with Hunter Thompson. And so I've gotten to know some of these musicians over that I admire, which is a lot of fun for me. But I live in Austin, Texas, and we brag we're the music capital. And, I love Nashville too. But we do more of the outlaw country down here. This is Willie Nelson territory, and Willie, just going to see Willie perform is always a joy There's the son of the novelist Larry McMurtry, who wrote Lonesome Dove. He lives here in Austin, and he performs at the Continental Club. James McMurtry.
Yes, I know
and he's
is.
really good, And so I keep the music going when I write, and I don't, and it's just part of it. And then when I was a graduate student at Georgetown, I worked as a night job as a guard in the Phillips Museum and the art world, just being in a museum environment when it's not crowded. I don't like crowded museums. When it's not real crowded, I get to spend a little time with the paintings, always gives me a lift. So I'm a humanities person. I've never tried to pretend that I'm in the science or math field. I'm not a STEM guy.
Yeah. So we're sitting here, this book I feel like is so well timed because we're recording this the day before Election Day. And this book, as you mentioned, is about the third wave of conservation and thinking about climate change and everything that's coming our way. I mean, where I live, this year wasn't bad, but every other year everything's on fire. And then I'm from North Carolina, and hurricanes are just ripping through there. And it just seems to be getting, by any standard, 98% of the scientists agree that things are getting bad. What gives you hope for climate change and for the future? Because there's a great quote in your acknowledgments. You say, you quote, I think David Brower said, "Have a good time saving the world, otherwise you're going to depress yourself." And you don't strike me as a depressed person. You strike me as an action-oriented person.
Well, it's the action. When you read Theodore Roosevelt and Rachel Carson and William O. Douglas, or, another one of people in the book, Cesar Chavez, who was, seeing Mexican-American farm workers getting hit by pesticides and organized boycotts and started fighting against the illness that was hitting his community in the San Joaquin Valley and elsewhere, Coachella Valley and all in California. You see that they fought. It's action. You got to talk up and do things. And so once in a while I get into a funk about it whenever, particularly for some reason, wildfires, something about seeing all of that Northern California burn in the summers just wipes me out. This year where I was closing Silent Spring Revolution, the Washburn fire up there was circling Mariposa Grove, which is the great grove where Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir camped together in the sequoias in Yosemite, and it's threatened to burn, and people trying to wrap aluminum foil around it and find sprinkler systems and all. But in the end, the firefighters contained it, but I'm not going to be Pollyannish about it. We're in deep trouble, and places, particularly Africa, droughts going to become famine. We're in for some tough times. Now, if you have money or well off, you're going to be able to navigate climate. You'll be able to move to. There's new communities that are, going to have better futures than others. It's not a great time to be building right directly on the Gulf of Mexico. And, people keep doing it. I wrote my book on Hurricane Katrina, the Great Deluge. Waveland, Mississippi was wiped off the map. And I went back weeks after the event working on a book, and the people were building right where their house was. And I said, why don't you guys move 12 miles inland? It's because I know that area of Mississippi well, a beautiful pine forest. You can build a house in a little area there and then just drive 12 miles and you're on the beach. And then when the storms come, you're 12 miles inland. And I said, my father lived here, my grandmother lived here, I'm going to live right here, and I'm going to rebuild right here. And so there's a lot of pain to come. And yet there's a lot of joy. You walk up, and if you see a hummingbird in your bush, or you're watching even a turkey vulture flying over the roadkill here in Austin, I start thinking about the natural world and how it's going to regenerate itself. But I'm frustrated at American politics. The fact that you have a midterm election in 2022 and climate change isn't one of the top 5 issues. Yes. That's enough to make me disgusted and feel we're doomed. But the point of being a teacher, as you said, is I'm influencing young people, and you have to make sure that they're ready to fight and take things on. Be optimistic. You can make change. And I do think what I learned from the 60s and 70s environmental movement was that they had fun at it. You know, Earth Day was fun, setting up science teaching exhibits and leaflets and doing tree plantings and demanding, wearing dressed up like Mickey Mouse, demanding that smog end in Los Angeles and music of people like Neil Young and Marvin Gaye, Mercy Me, The Ecology, and Joan Baez and Pete Seeger. And, you have to weigh into it and wake people up and do it with an open heart. I saw some climate activists doing the most disgusting thing I can imagine, gluing themselves to Van Gogh paintings in Europe to promote climate. What idiots. Utter fools. I hope they get arrested and go to jail. So I'm talking about protesting in a smart way, fun way, keep it upbeat and do good things. And, Gary Snyder, famous poet, Pulitzer Prize winning poet who writes a lot about the natural world, has a line in a poem to kids. And he says, stay together, learn the flowers, and stay light.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
And the idea is stay light. It's not a time to be dark and negative or narcissistic or gloomy, but care about your community and pitch in. And oftentimes, if every community starts a movement to beautify their village, their city, their local lake, their local river, restock with fish, create bird flyways, it has a ripple effect. And so, join conservation or environment, whichever term you choose, but get in there and at least be participatory.
Well, speaking of action, I'm going to get out of here so you can continue your action because you got a lot coming up. But thank you for everything you've done, for having me here to talk with you. Your work has made my life, talk about ripple effects, it's made my life infinitely better. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. Keep it going, and we'll do it again soon.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. But thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.